Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I am Evan Pierce. Before everything fell apart, I worked the night shift at a distribution warehouse and volunteered with the county fire department on weekends. I was used to emergency tones in the middle of a meal, to the smell of diesel on turnout coats, and to the sense that bad days end when the sun comes up. I was wrong about that last part. The morning the first radio call said, "Do not approach unless absolutely necessary," I learned there are days that keep going even when the sun is high. The town sirens wailed at 10 a.m. for a shelter-in-place order. By 2:15 p.m, our chief told us to step away from non-essential calls and secure our families. By evening, we were watching a convoy of state trucks blow past the station, not even slowing down when a man ran into the road waving a shirt. I left the engine bay, drove home in low gear with the window cracked, and saw two neighbours arguing in the street with a third, who staggered but never answered. I packed what I could in 15 minutes. Then I did what I had told myself I would do if the worst ever happened. I went to the meeting point. The place was a farmer's market parking lot, usually full of honey tables and handmade soap. That day, it was empty except for the five of us. Tanya Brooks pulled in first, her SUV already half loaded with cases of water and a first aid kit so big it looked like it belonged in a clinic. She is a trauma nurse. She had on scrubs and a hoodie and kept looking at her phone, even when we all knew the networks were failing. Next came Benji Ramos, a mechanic I met at the station when he volunteered to service our pumps after storms. His van carried tools, a floor jack, and a plastic box of mixed bolts and hose clamps that ended up being one of the most useful items we had. Mason Hale rolled up in a dusty pickup with a camper shell, windows plastered with old National Park stickers. He had been a ranger until a leg injury forced him out. He talked in short sentences and knew long lists of trails by memory. The last to arrive was Jody Kim, 19, first-year engineering student home from college, riding a second-hand motorcycle and wearing a backpack bigger than she was. The plan had lived on notes and texts for years. We joked about it when wildfires threatened, when hurricanes brushed the coast, when the local dam failed inspections, and everyone wondered. If roads were blocked or town became unsafe, we would leave for high ground. Mason had once worked a seasonal post at a state park fire tower with an attached ranger cabin. He called it Skybridge because when you were up there, it felt like you were walking on a bridge made of air and wind. The official map named it something like North Overlook Lookout, but we used his name. It was 37 miles west by back roads and service lanes that weren't on standard GPS. It had a steel door, a narrow access ladder, and enough distance from any town that most people would never think of it. That was the theory. We met at 6:20 p.m. The sun was low. We didn't waste time. Our convoy formed up, Mason's pickup in the lead, my truck second with Tanya riding shotgun and the rest of her gear strapped in the back. Benji's van third, and Jody's motorcycle paced beside us on the right, where we could see her in the mirror. We took county roads, not the highway, because the highway had miles of stopped cars and flashing hazard lights. Twice we idled with the engines off, while Mason scouted around downed branches. Once we reversed a quarter mile because someone had parked a box truck across a narrow bridge and abandoned it. In town, I'd seen people shouting and two people on the ground not moving. Out here, I saw hawks riding thermals and a deer that bounded across a slope as if the world hadn't changed. It had. We just hadn't caught up. At 8:05 p.m, we reached the service gate. It was chained but not locked. Mason tugged it open slowly to keep it from rattling. The road beyond was single-lane gravel that wound upward until it disappeared into trees. A faded sign said, "Authorized vehicles only." We became authorized with a look, a nod, and the sound of tires crunching stone. The tower did not appear all at once. We saw pieces, a guy wire, then a post with a faded lightning warning, then a coil of old hose next to a concrete pedestal where the ranger cabin sat. When the trees finally opened, there it was. Rising above us, steel legs anchored in concrete, a ladder caged in wire, and at the top a square of glass, with the last light of the day reflecting back at us. The ranger cabin beside the tower was small and simple. It had a tiny kitchen with a propane stove, a bunk, shelves with field guides, a desk with a logbook that stopped the previous autumn, and a corner where a compact solar charge controller sat under a pair of lead-acid batteries. The panels were outside on a rack, fenced with chain link. A 100-gallon propane tank sat on a concrete pad behind the cabin, with a snow cap of bird droppings hardened over time. A fiberglass rain gutter fed a downspout into a blue barrel with a mesh screen and a first flush diverter that you had to turn by hand. A steel door with a heavy bar closed the cabin off. I checked the latch and it swung open. No one had been here in months. The smell told me that. Old dust, dry paper, sun-warmed wood. We parked, shut engines down without slamming doors, and worked in the last light. Benji and I carried the battery box out into the open and checked the cables. Tanya inventoried food and water while Jody read the notes on the solar controller and quietly put the logbook on the desk like a promise we would write in it. Mason did a slow walk around the tower, the guy wires, the anchor bolts, and the posts, as if he were reading a story on paper. When he finished, he nodded once. "Good bones," he said. It was the longest sentence he spoke that night. We made rules that first evening, because rules are easier to make before they are tested. We would keep a watch at all hours. We would not fire weapons unless there was no other choice. We would ration consumables, plan meals, and track usage. We would not bring anyone up the ladder unless they were medically cleared by Tanya and agreed to follow the rules. We would use radios to listen before we chose to speak. We would treat the tower as the last line of defense, not the first. All that sounded organized and neat, and it was. It made us feel like we were ahead of events. Later we learned events don't care how prepared you feel. The first 3 days established a rhythm that felt almost like work. We slept in shifts, 2 on the floor of the cabin, 2 in the observation room at the top of the tower, where you could see the line of the ridges cut against the sky, and 1 on watch. The access ladder was caged in wire, with a locking hatch at the tower platform 12 feet up. Below that, we chained a sheet of steel that we found leaning against the cabin. We used a small padlock I'd pulled from my garage. We inventoried food, canned beans, rice in a sealed bucket, old trail mix, dried pasta, and a half-dozen MREs left by a crew the summer before. The seasonal staff had kept supplies with dates on labels. We added our own, the water we carried, the canned goods Tanya had bought in a rush, and a box of instant oatmeal packets. States of the Union had printed on the back like a school project. The solar array consisted of 4 100-watt panels wired in parallel, feeding a charge controller that stepped it down to charge the batteries. The batteries were old, but they held voltage. In full sun, we could run the cabin lights, and a small 2-meter radio at low power, charge handheld radios, and top off the batteries by mid-afternoon. The radio tower beside the lookout had a 2-bay antenna, a weather-beaten duplexer in a cabinet, and an empty equipment rack. Whatever had been installed there had been removed, probably when budgets cut the seasonal programs. I still had my ham ticket from when I was 19, so the plan was to rig a temporary station. We set a small VHF whip on the railing and tuned it with a simple standing wave meter that I kept in a plastic bin. It worked well enough to scan the local repeaters. We monitored NOAA weather on 162.550 MHz and 162.400 MHz and listened to county fire dispatch. I knew the tones by sound even before the numbers came across. Structure fire assignments, medical calls, and then a steady stream of unknown problem, an unconscious person, that built until, on the afternoon of day 2, the recordings gave way to a single loop. Due to ongoing public safety operations, this channel is restricted to emergency traffic only. The dispatcher's voice was strained and a little hoarse. No one told jokes on the radio. No one said, "Be safe," like they always did when somebody cleared a call. By the evening of day 3, the channel was quiet, more often than it was not. We put the radio on scan and drank coffee that tasted like metal, and the silence felt like it had mass. We did not sit still. Mason set a perimeter walk twice a day at 8 a.m. and 4 p.m, and one of us went with him. He talked about tracks and animal sign and what to note when you were tired. He showed Jody how to pace out distance and mark it with a loop of orange flagging tape high on a branch. He told us to look not only for what was present, but for what had changed. Broken branches, fresh scuffs, pressed grass. We stored water in labelled jugs and cycled it. The cabin's rain catchment fed into a barrel with a screen. We added a cloth pre-filter, then ran what we used through a gravity filter and still boiled it if the source was suspect. Tanya set up an area in the cabin as a clinic with gloves, gauze, a blood pressure cuff, a pulse oximeter, and a plastic tote of over-the-counter medicines. She wrote dosages on a sheet of paper taped to the wall. She built order out of little things. Weapons were practical tools, not bravado. Mason carried a .30, 30 lever-action rifle he had owned for 20 years and knew as well as he knew his hands. I had a 12-gauge pump shotgun with an 18.5-inch barrel and a short stock that I could use either for slugs or buckshot. Benji had a 9mm pistol in a worn holster that he had practiced with only occasionally, so we made the rule he would not fire unless it was a last resort. Tanya carried a compact revolver, not because she wanted to, but because she had completed her permit course 2 years ago and knew that want and need are different. Jody did not carry. She said plainly she did not feel ready. We listened to that. Mason taught her how to handle each weapon in a safe state, how to clear it, how to chamber a round deliberately, and how to stand so your feet were under you. We set a practice line at a dead stump 50 yards down a slope, and every morning before breakfast we fired 2 or 3 rounds each to keep the nerves out of our muscles. We picked up our brass like it was worth money. On day 4, fog rolled up from the valleys and wrapped the ridge so tight that sound felt muffled. On day 5, the fog burned away, and we could see the blue line of the mountains layered like a stack of faded denim. On day 6 and 7, we saw smoke columns in 3 directions. One was a farm we recognized by the red roof. One was near a trailer park. One was on the valley floor, like a square block of an old neighborhood. Some columns pulsed and died, then rose again. We described what we saw into a logbook in clean block letters: time, direction, estimate of distance. The act of writing made us feel like we were contributing something beyond our own survival. Jody drew a rough map and taped it to the wall. We spotted the first infected on day 6. I use the word because I do not have a better one. He walked along the service road below us at around 1:30 p.m, steady, not shambling, just walking, with his head turning in a slow arc like he was trying to smell. He wore a dress shirt and 1 shoe. He never looked up. He put a hand on a gatepost and left a streak. We did not breathe for as long as he was in front of us. He moved on. Mason said, "Wind carried our scent up. He doesn't have a reason to come uphill if he doesn't know we're here." We didn't test that hypothesis. We stayed quiet, and we stayed small. Early chores felt reasonable. We cleaned the cabin and the lookout room at the top of the tower. We checked the bolts on the ladders with a wrench. We hung a line inside to dry clothes when the fog blew through. Benji and I inspected the propane system. The tank was marked 100 gallons on the collar, but the gauge read just above 10%. At 10%, usable volume is around 8 to 10 gallons, and some of that you will never draw because of pressure loss. The cabin stove ran fine, and the small generator put out a steady tone at low loads on a bench test. But we agreed we would use propane only when we had to. The solar would cover our lighting and charging. The batteries would do the rest. We wrote on the whiteboard in the cabin, propane for cooking when rain only, generator, test weekly, run only for medical or emergency. We kept watch at night using a small red filtered flashlight and a pair of binoculars with a cracked strap. We took turns with the radio at low volume. There were other voices still, here and there. Some on FRS consumer channels with people asking where their relatives were. Some on GMRS frequencies with families boasting call signs they had picked last week. Sometimes we heard a ham operator call for check-ins on 146.520 MHz, the 2-meter calling frequency, then give up after getting only static. Once we heard a clear, calm voice on a fireground channel giving instructions to a crew to retreat. We listened to their boots on gravel and someone breathing hard, and then it cut to a carrier without voice. We did not sleep well after that. Day 13 began clear. It felt like a lucky number if you were tired and wanted one day to go as planned. At 10:45 a.m, I climbed the tower to relieve Jodie on watch. We traded notes. She had seen a deer cross the service road and a hawk dive and pull back. She had written in the logbook that the wind shifted to the west. I took the binoculars, sat on the stool, and made a slow scan from north to east to south. That was when I saw it. A column of smoke that did not rise and disperse like a brush pile, but funneled and roiled like a structure fire, or a vehicle fully involved. It came from the west, maybe 3 to 4 miles away. I called it down. We've got a column, west by southwest. Looks like a car or building, plumes dark, gaining height. Mason climbed up. He looked, squinted and nodded once, which meant it matched his expectations. Tanya stood below, with a hand to her forehead against the glare. Benji came out of the cabin and set down a wrench like it was still connected to his hand. At 11:30 a.m. we heard something new. Voices, not on the radio, but carried by air, thin and uncertain. I couldn't make out the words, just the pattern of speech, calls and replies. Within minutes we saw movement at the base of the slope, where the service road S-curved and past the last of the poison oak patches. There were 5 people. They were dirty, sunburned, and moving like each step was a test. One leaned on another. One carried a pack that sagged. One had a jacket tied around her waist with sleeves that thumped her thighs. They looked up and saw the tower. "Hey!" a man shouted. "We see you. We're not sick. We need water. Please, please help us." We had rehearsed this. We still felt like we were improvising. Tanya stepped to the edge of the cabin platform and raised her hand in a greeting that could also be a stop sign. Her voice was trained in overnight hallways with patients who didn't want to hear bad news. It carried without any harshness. "We hear you," she called. "Stop where you are. Sit down if you need to. We have rules for coming up. I will explain them. If you agree, we will help." They stopped. They looked at each other like the word rules meant safety, not exclusion. The one who leaned coughed, not the sharp, dry cough of a throat cleared, but the deep chest cough of a fever. The sound hit all of us in the same place at once. I went down the ladder to the cabin deck. Mason stood with his rifle slung but ready. Benji stayed out of line of sight because he knew he would be the one who couldn't hide his expression. Jodie stayed up in the lookout with binoculars and a pencil, and I could see the knuckles of her hand white where she gripped. Tanya spoke to them. "We have a nurse here," she said. "That's me. I'm going to ask you questions. We have water to give you once you sit. We have to make sure you're not ill before we bring you up. If anyone is injured, I need to see the injury before I can treat it." The man who had shouted first nodded. "Understood," he called back. He spoke to the others softly. It sounded like names. Then, "Do what she says." They sat on the gravel. The one who had leaned coughed again and wrapped arms tight around her chest like it hurt. Tanya's voice didn't change. "Name," she called, pointing to each in turn. They answered. "Carlos, Renee, Tom, Ava, Jared." They said where they were coming from, how long they had been walking, that they had eaten the last of their crackers that morning. They said they had seen things they didn't want to talk about. Tanya asked about bites. They all said no. Tanya asked them to roll up sleeves and pant legs and show their necks. They did. She asked to see their torsos. 2 did without hesitating. The others looked up at the height and then at Mason and then at each other. "Last night we were chased," Carlos said. We fell in scrub. I have scratches. He raised his shirt. Tanya handed me the binoculars and told me where to look. I saw faint, parallel scratches along his ribs, like he had slid under a fence. They were scabbed, not inflamed. "Who is coughing?" Tanya asked. "Me," said Jared. "I have asthma. It's the running and the smoke." "Do you have an inhaler?" Tanya asked. Jared shook his head. "Gone," he said. "I lost my pack crossing a creek." "Any fever?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "I feel hot. We've been in the sun." Tanya looked at me. I knew what she was asking without words. Do we bring them up and segregate? Do we keep them below and pass water down? Do we send them away? I thought about the long walk we had done the first night from the service gate to the tower. I thought about how my legs shook. I thought about the first night we drank coffee and heard sirens cut and then nothing. I thought about a dozen calls with the fire department where we arrived, and the difference between a good outcome and a bad one had been 30 seconds and a calm voice. I looked at the 5 at the base of the tower. I thought about the rule we had written on the whiteboard. Help if you can, survive if you must. I nodded. Tanya nodded back and adjusted the rule to fit this exact moment. "You can come up one at a time," she called. "We will give you water at the landing. Before you enter the cabin, I will take your temperature with a non-contact thermometer. We will check your oxygen level with a finger clip. We will inspect you for injuries again. If anyone is sick, we will isolate him. Do not touch our equipment unless you are told to. Do you agree?" They agreed. We lowered a rope with a carabiner so they could clip their packs and pull them up, and then we lowered the chain across the lower rungs. They climbed one at a time. Each reached the landing and sat with back against the wall. We gave water in cups, not bottles, because a cup can be controlled and washed. A bottle is a commitment. We took temperatures. 4 were normal or very slightly elevated, likely from exertion. Jared's was 100.8 Fahrenheit. His oxygen saturation was 92% at rest, which is low but not crisis. He wheezed when he lay back and coughed when he sat forward. He answered questions with clear eyes. He drank water like it was the only thing left in his life. We cleared Carlos first, and then Renee and Tom and Ava. We brought them into the cabin and sat them on the floor and gave them food that wouldn't wreck their stomachs. Ramen noodles, half a cup each with broth, and a quarter of a granola bar like a joke, but not a joke. We set their packs against the wall and gave them space. We told them the rules again. They listened with the special attention of people who have nothing more to lose. With Jared, we hesitated. We had an isolation plan written on an index card. Use the lookout room at the top of the tower. Keep the cabin for the well. Keep the sick separate but still in sight. It was a good plan at noon on a clear day. It was a plan that gets stress tested when wind shifts and you hear sound that means rain will hammer the roof and panels in 20 minutes. Clouds had built while we worked. The first drops, big and heavy and slow, hit the railing like someone tapping with a spoon. The wind swung. We had to decide whether to keep Jared on the landing in the wet, bring him inside where he would spread whatever he had, or move him to the top where we could see him, but not hear him without climbing. We moved him to the top. We gave him 2 blankets, a bottle of water, and a basin. We told him we would check on him every hour. We told him that if he felt worse, he should call down in a normal voice, and we would hear. He thanked us and coughed, and the cough sounded like it came from a long way down a tunnel. The rain came hard enough to flatten grass. We closed the shutters on the windward side of the lookout room. The panels on the rack flexed and then held. Water ran down the gutter into the barrel. I went out in a rain jacket to turn the first flush diverter to keep debris out of the main barrel, and by the time I got back inside, my sleeves had taken on water through the seams. The charge controller dropped from a steady green light to a flashing yellow that meant output had fallen below the set point. Inside the cabin, we used one small LED lamp on the lowest setting and still cast shadows like we were in a cave. The handheld radios on the table showed 2 bars. We had misjudged how much we were charging and how much we were consuming. It wasn't a critical error. It was a slow erosion that turned into an immediate priority when the first lightning hit somewhere close, and our charge controller did something I had only seen in manuals. It flashed red and shut down to protect itself. Benji and I went outside and found two problems. The first was that the rain had backed up small debris under the panel rack and turned a lower cable run into a dam. The second was that one of the MC4 connectors that joined the panel leads had cracked, probably from a rock thrown up by a mower last season. Water had found its way inside. It wasn't a short yet, but it would be. I opened the junction box, dried connections with a towel, and taped plastic over the cracked connector as a temporary fix. The charge controller restarted and gave us a weak charge in the dim light. We all knew this fix would not last if the crack grew or if water found a new path. We said we would address it when the rain ended. It did not end that day. Inside, Tanya's face told me two things at once. Gratitude that the lights clicked back on, and worry that we were down to solving problems with tape. She motioned to the stairs. "He's coughing more," she said quietly. "His fever is up to 101.6. His oxygen is 90%. I listened with the stethoscope. There are crackles in the lower left. Could be an infection starting. I don't have oral antibiotics carelessly, and I won't use the last of our supply without certainty. I can start him on fluids, acetaminophen, and steam. But he needs rest and time, and not to get chilled." She glanced at the door, and the way water blew under it in gusts. We laid a towel. We set a pot to simmer on the propane stove, long enough to get steam, then shut the gas off. We did what we could do. We could not do what we could not. At 4:40 p.m., standing at the cabin sink filling a bottle, Benji lifted the window shade a finger's width and said, You all should see this." We came over. Through the rain, we saw movement lower on the slope, a slow line of figures moving uphill, not in a rush, not running, just moving with the persistent determination you see in careless weather, when people decide to do a hike no matter what. There were 8 of them. They were spaced irregularly. One would stop and then the rest would adjust, like beads on a chain. None of them called out. None of them looked up. They were far enough away that if we hadn't been watching, we might have missed them. They were close enough to get here by nightfall if they kept moving. We dimmed the lamp. We shut the door that led to the small deck. We checked the lower ladder chain and ensured the padlock was set. We radioed Jody in the lookout room, even though she was just above us. "You have eyes on lower slope," I said quietly. "Yes," she said. "They're spreading out, not together. They stop and sway. The one in front drags one foot." She didn't add words to describe. She didn't need to. "Stay put," I said. "We will deal with the door. If anything touches the ladder, call." Noise draws attention. Light draws attention. Smell draws attention. Our rule had been to minimize all 3 when there was any sign of infected nearby. That evening, we moved like a family in a house with a sleeping baby. We ate cold food. We made no more coffee. We used whispers that were more habit than required. The rain softened to a steady hiss. The figures on the slope disappeared when the light left. And then we had a different problem. Darkness at ground level means we can't see what moves, but our tower is a silhouette on the skyline for anyone who glances up. We made a choice to bring Jody down so we weren't split. We eased the hatch and she climbed down, moving like each rung mattered. At 9:15 p.m, Jared coughed and called, "Water!" in a voice that was small and polite, even in discomfort. Tanya went up with the thermos and listened to his lungs again. "No worse," she said when she came down. "But he is more tired. His fever is still up." We put a cool cloth on his head and left a flashlight with instructions to use only if he needed to climb down. He said he would not. He said the room was warm and the blankets were fine. He said thank you again in a way that carried. We closed the hatch. We slept in pieces. I remember waking to the sound of water dripping and counting between drips. I remember Benji's breathing from the other corner and the creak of wood as someone turned over. I remember a noise that sounded like a raccoon and woke me fully because my mind wanted it to be something I knew. It was not a raccoon. It was the sound of a hand on chain. At 12:52 a.m., the chain on the lower ladder rattled, not a tug, not a crash, but a slow test, like someone trying to open a door gently so as not to wake anyone. The padlock clicked against the rung, the chain creaked, we froze in place and moved at the same time. Mason pointed at me, and then at the light switch, and I already had my hand there. We shut it. The cabin went black. The rain's hiss became louder because it had to fill the space where our breath stopped. The chain rattled again, the slow, insistent test of someone who is not concerned with stealth, but is not in a rush either. We had rehearsed battle positions the way people rehearse fire drills. Mason took the door. I covered the main window. Benji stood by to hand whatever was needed, tools or rope or batteries. Tanya took her revolver and set it on the desk with her hand on it, but her mind on the stairs. We waited. The chain creaked twice more and then stopped. The sound moved right, then left, then away like footsteps in grass. Mason nodded to me. I turned the light back on to the low setting. We did not speak for a minute, and then we spoke too much in a low burst. "We hold," Mason said at the end of it. "We do not fire unless we must." At 2:10 a.m., the wind shifted and brought a smell that made the small hairs on my arm rise. It was a heavy, sweet, wrong smell. The smell you get walking by a dumpster behind a grocery store in the heat, but magnified. It did not rise and fall. It arrived and stayed. We knew what it was and did not say it. Saying a word does not make it truer. It only uses more air. By dawn, the rain had moved east. Cloud broke and light came through in squares. We opened the shutter on the east window an inch. The slope below was empty. The chain on the lower ladder had a smear across one link that had not been there before. A dark streak like someone had dragged a hand with grime on it. We made a note and cleaned it. At 8:30 a.m., we heard a soft call from above. "Tanya?" Jared said. His voice was thin. She went up the ladder with the thermos and her kit. She was up there longer than before. When she came down, she sat on the floor without speaking for a full minute, elbows on knees, her hands folded. Then she said, "His fever is 102.4. His oxygen is 87% at rest. I can hear crackles on both lower lobes. He is sweating and thirsty. He is also aware, and he is not confused. He says he's sorry he is using our resources. He says he does not want to cause a problem." She rubbed her eyes. "I'm starting the antibiotic," she said. "I have a course that I was saving. I'm not saving it anymore." The decision drained our small pharmacy in a way that was both moral and practical. We had a limited number of antibiotic doses. Giving it now meant we were choosing him over an unknown later scenario. It was the right call. It still felt like a heavy one. Benji had a different heavy realization around 10 a.m. He had spent an hour out behind the cabin, checking the generator and the propane lines. When he came back in, he had the look he gets when he has to tell a customer their car needs more than a belt. "The propane tank," he said, "reads 10%. That needle either hasn't moved for a while, or it moved down a little overnight when we ran the stove for steam. Either way, this is almost empty. This is a single-digit gallon situation, and there's something else. The cap over the fill valve shows tool marks. Someone siphoned this tank sometime last season, or over winter. They took what they could get. We have less than we thought." We updated the whiteboard. No propane unless medical. Boil water only if necessary. Run generator only if we have to power radio for distress, or for oxygen if needed. I scribbled the last words and stopped because writing oxygen made me think ahead to Jared turning worse, and me rigging an airline to a compressor that we didn't own, and that thought sank in my stomach like a stone. I erased the word and replaced it with medical equipment. The rain returned in squalls the next 2 days. Each time it smacked the panels, the charge controller flickered between decent output and barely any. We could run the radio to listen. We could charge the handhelds if we did nothing else. We cut our lighting to the minimum and used headlamps sparingly. We moved like careful people in a museum at night, avoiding bumping anything we didn't mean to. The infected did not return to the ladder those days. We saw two lower on the slope once at mid-morning. They walked through scrub, and then into trees, and then out of sight. They did not change course toward us. I understood then that our biggest safety feature was not height, but obscurity. Few would climb this far unless they believed there was something at the top. The world contains more movement than intent when people are lost. On the evening of the second day after they arrived, I climbed the tower at 6 p.m. to give Tanya a break. I carried the thermometer and the pulse oximeter. I knocked on the hatch before I opened it because privacy is dignity even in a square room of glass. "How are you?" I asked. "Apologizing less," he said. "That's a good sign," I said. I took his temperature. 103.1. His oxygen was 85. He did not look panicked, he looked resigned. "Do you remember the lake at the state fairgrounds?" he asked suddenly. "We used to go there to watch fireworks. My daughter liked the reflection in the water." He told me her name. It was not a name I will write here. I told him about my dad teaching me to change the oil in a car in a gravel driveway. He smiled once at a story about a wrench slipping and knuckles skinned, and then he coughed, and the smile went out like a candle at the end of its wick. At 8:40 p.m, the radio squawked on the 2-meter calling frequency. Not a voice, but a sudden burst like someone keyed up while the microphone was in a pocket. We froze and listened. "K4 something, if you hear this, anyone," a voice said, then cut. It sounded tired and frustrated. "Male, older than me." I keyed up and said, "This is KJ4EYP at high elevation. Copy your call. Please repeat." There was static and then, "Didn't think anyone was left up there." The voice gave a call sign I half recognized from nets years ago. We exchanged quick information. Location, general status. No specifics that would help anyone who might be listening with bad intent. He said he was on a ridge 20 miles south with a small group, food for a week, water from a spring, and a damaged ankle he was nursing. He said he had heard traffic 2 days ago from a state incident command that had moved farther west and stopped. He said he had not heard a stable voice since. He said he would call again at 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. daily. We agreed to listen. The contact felt like a hand on a shoulder. It did not change our immediate circumstance, but it told us we were not alone on all the ridges. Night came. We slept. The wind stopped around 3 a.m. so abruptly that it woke me. The absence of noise can be louder than any crash. The silence preceded the scream. I will describe the scream simply, because that is the only way to do it that feels true. It came from above. It came from Jared. It rose quickly to a pitch that made your jaw hurt and then broke as if someone had closed his throat. It ended in a sound that was not a word. We were on our feet before it ended, because we know the difference between a cry of pain and something else. This was both. Tanya was first to the ladder. She paused on the rung below the hatch, gun on her belt, medical kit on a strap, and said in a calm voice, "Jared, I'm coming in." There was no answer. She opened the hatch lid with her left hand and kept her right on the rung. She moved the lid slowly and then smoothly to avoid a bang. The room above was dark. I heard Tanya's breath and then the sound of a foot against a metal rung above me. She climbed. I followed 3 steps behind, shotgun pointed down so as not to be where I didn't want it when we were chest to chest. Benji had his hand on my belt. Mason stood at the base, covering the door in case the ladder was a distraction. Jody stood by the cabin door with a flashlight off but ready. When Tanya's head came level with the hatch, she took one breath and said very quietly, "Evan, wait." I stopped with my foot on the rung. She eased herself up, gun now in her hand, but down, not pointed at anything. She said in that same hallway voice, "Jared, I need you to speak if you can." She waited 3 seconds and then said, "Okay, Evan, come up." I came up. The room smelled like fever. It also smelled like something else I will not describe. The blanket lay in a pile near the chair. The water bottle had tipped and dripped a line across the floor to the far corner. The basin had slewed half under the desk. In the space where the bedroll had been, there was a shape on the floor. It was not moving. Tanya knelt with a glove on one hand and put 2 fingers on the neck. She placed her other hand on the face and tilted the head. She held for a count of 5. When she stood, she stepped back and put her hand on my arm. "He is gone," she said. "We have all walked the last small steps after big words. We did then. There is a difference, though, because of what we had all seen, and because the world had taught us in the worst way that gone might not be the end of a sequence. We needed to ensure he would not rise and become a risk to the rest of us. We had agreed on what we would do if someone died under our care, and it was safe to act. We would render the person unable to harm, and then we would take the body away from the living space. We would do it with as much care as we could. We would not prolong it. We would not make it a scene. We carried out our plan. I will not add detail that is not needed. It was quiet, efficient, and done with hands that did not shake until after. When we were finished, we wrapped him and tied the wrap. We waited until first light. We took him down and away from the cabin to a stand of trees where the ground was soft. Mason spoke words I did not know he had saved. We stood in a line. We marked the place with a stone. We wrote his name on a small piece of paper and put it in the logbook. We set a rock on top of the paper so it wouldn't blow away when we opened the book again. We said thank you without speaking, because saying that out loud would have been too much. When we returned to the cabin, a new day had started, and with it the sound of something we had not heard that close. Feet on gravel, many, not running, not hurrying, just a slow, steady trample that you feel in your souls more than hear in your ears. We looked down the slope and saw them, a line like a procession coming up from the right where the service road dipped, then curving across a patch of ferns, then fanning out. 10, 12, maybe more. I remember counting to 9 and then losing count because I saw one that crawled and then stood and then stumbled and then got pulled forward by the bodies behind it. We were not invisible anymore. The scream in the night and the movement and the early morning footsteps and the smell of food we had reheated for the new group and the rain that held scent close had combined into a map that pointed to us. The infected had found a track that led uphill. They did not look up. They did not signal. They simply moved toward the place where movement had been and would be again. We had 2 minutes, maybe 3. We had rehearsed this too. We shut and barred the steel cabin door. We hustled the 4 newcomers into the cabin and positioned them along the back wall away from the window. We checked the lower ladder barrier and pulled it tight. We hauled our packs to the inner corner because we knew we might have to run and did not want to be packing while we did. Benji set out the rope for the emergency descent line we had installed on day 2 using eye bolts and a roller on the far side of the platform where the slope fell away at a sharp angle. Rangers used it as a quick way to send gear down. We had joked about it then. It did not feel funny now. Mason took the window. Tanya took the door. I went up the ladder into the lookout room because from there I could command the exact spot where the ladder met the landing and had a clean arc down the steps if someone got through. Jody climbed up beside me with the binoculars and the small hand radio. Benji stayed by the rope, and then, when we saw the first heads appear below, he swallowed once and moved to the opposite side of the cabin to keep the rope out of any grab. The first infected to reach the ladder didn't hesitate. It put a hand on the chain and pulled, then climbed up to the chain with a twist that showed no care for skin or knuckles. It tested the padlock with dumb patience. It made no noise but breath. Behind it, others pressed, then spread, then stood at odd angles as if they had remembered there was such a thing as waiting, but not fully how to do it. One put a hand on the calf of the one on the ladder, and the one on the ladder did not react. We had made rules about firing. Mason looked up at me, and I shook my head. He nodded. He waited. When the first infected pulled hard enough on the chain to shift the lower rung, I heard the steel creak and imagined it giving half an inch, then an inch, then, and then. "Okay," I said. 1. I used a slug, not shot, because a slug carries energy in one place, and I did not want pattern spread going where I did not intend. I aimed low, at the wrist on the chain, not at the head, because my goal was to stop the pulling hand from causing the chain to loosen. The slug hit, and the wrist flopped, and then did nothing. The body attached to it did not fall back. It hung by the forearm, and the chain, sticky now with something dark, slid along the skin. The body did not cry out. The others on the slope turned heads not toward the sound, but toward the motion of the body shifting. Mason fired once. The infected on the ladder fell back, and the second surged forward to take its place. We hit a rhythm that was not sustainable. Fire, rack the action, fire, assess, conserve ammunition, control the field of fire so that any misses went into hillside and not across to the ridge. The line below thickened. A third hand reached up and scraped at the chain. The padlock shifted a fraction of an inch. Benji called, "Rope ready. Jody, if we're going, you're number 3. He had assigned numbers the first day. He called them now without looking at anyone. His voice was steady even though the muscle in his jaw jumped. Tanya shouted over the gunfire, "Inside, under the table," to the newcomers. They slid under the heavy table that had a steel frame. It was not a bad place if the door failed. Her revolver stayed on the desk. She had not fired it yet. She had a knife in her pocket and her hands free to triage if someone went down. Her face was pale and controlled. The chain on the ladder creaked again. A fourth infected found the exact spot where weight would leave her against the lower rung. The padlock strained and held. Behind them, the heads kept bobbing into view. Some came from the left where the grade was less steep. Some came around the right where the ground was covered in ivy. We were getting pulled apart by physics and numbers. If we stayed, the chain would eventually fail, or the ladder would become a stack of bodies, high enough that they could climb over and pile up to the landing. If we left a place that had water, elevation, and structure. We had run through this decision in our noise-free, light-free drills. It was different with breath in your ears, and 3 used shell casings rolling under your boot. Mason made the decision I should have made 5 seconds earlier. "We go," he said in a voice that was not loud, but had steel in it. "Rope. Benji, you first to test it. Then Ava and Renee. Then Jody. Then Evan. Then Tanya. I hold until last." He did not say, because I can't run as fast with this leg, but I heard it even if he wouldn't say it. I said, "No, I hold with you." He shook his head once. "Order is order," he said. That was Ranger Hale at a trail edge with a storm coming. It was a tone that made people move. Benji clipped the rope into his harness with hands that did not fumble, swung a leg over the railing and slid. The rope sang along the roller. He disappeared over the slope and then his voice came up clear. "Solid landing, 2 body lengths below a ledge. I have footing. Send the next." Ava went, then Renee, breathing fast and holding one hand in a fist so tight her knuckles were white. Jody clipped in and looked at me with eyes that were both scared and lit with something like determination. "See you in 15 seconds, she said, and she slid. Tanya hustled the newcomers from under the table to the rope and kept count. I covered the ladder and fired only when the chain pulled hard enough to threaten the lock. We had minutes. We had seconds. I don't know which. Time changes when your body is fully occupied. My turn came. I looked at Mason. He had shifted to the door and braced his back against the frame, hand on the lever, ready to throw it open to buy a clean field of fire for me to go past. "You come," I said. "I'll..." He cut me off with a look that said, "We do not waste breath on arguments now." I clipped my harness, swung over, and slid. Speed on a rope is not bravery. It is friction and gravity, and a choice you make with your hands. I made it fast then, control points in my gloves smoking a little, boots skimming rock faces, and finding small ledges to push off. Below, Benji guided me with a hand gesture to land on a patch of dirt that looked like nothing and became my whole world when my boots hit. He grabbed my shoulder and unclipped me. I turned to look up. Tanya came next. She slid with her legs wide and her elbows in. She landed, stepped aside, and almost fell, then laughed once at her own body, finding humor where there was none. She motioned to the next. Mason was last. He waited until the chain creaked again, and then fired once, not to hit a head, but to change the timing of the hands on the chain. The bodies at the ladder shifted. He clipped in fast. He slid. Halfway down the rope, something changed. His speed picked up too quickly for a second. He grunted, corrected, and then sailed into Benji's reach. He landed and rolled through his ankles like he had done this 100 times. He stood up, but slower than he used to. He put a hand on his thigh and squeezed it once, and then took it away. We moved. The emergency line had taken us to a slope that led into trees, and then into a shallow drainage that hid us from the tower if anyone was looking toward it. We had packed the previous day. We didn't have to choose what to bring when the rope still swayed in the wind behind us. We had chosen already. We carried what we needed to travel for 2 days without a refill. Water, calorie bars, a small stove, a trowel, the radio, the map, the medical kit, and the ammunition we had left. We left behind the cabin, the tower, the solar panels with a cracked connector, the whiteboard with rules and scribbles, the logbook with fresh ink and a rock on a sheet of paper, and the idea that height and distance equal safety. We left above us the banging of bodies against a chain that would hold for 5 more minutes or 30, and then not. We moved into the woods in a line of 2, and then 3, then 2 again, spacing not for comfort, but for coverage. Mason took point until his breath went tight. Then I went around him and set a pace I thought the back could hold. Benji carried the rope coiled like a big sleeping snake, and a look on his face that said he wanted to turn around and fix the connector, and the panel, and the controller, and the entire situation with tools and time. Tanya kept the newcomers between us and counted heads in a whisper, as if she was still at a hospital roll call. Jody carried the radio clipped on her shoulder and listened so intently that she flinched when a bird flapped. We stepped over a log, we ducked under a branch, we walked into a world that had the same trees and the same dirt as last week, and was not the same world. We reached the service road and turned down slope, using the drainage to hide our silhouettes. Twice we stopped and waited for 3 minutes without moving, just to make sure we weren't making noise, only to outrun it. At 11:20 a.m. we heard a faint clatter from above, and then something like a shout without words. We did not look up. We kept moving. We set our destination as the next ridgeline, where the map showed an old timber road that would take us toward a ranger maintenance shed. If the shed was intact, it would have nails and bolts and maybe a first aid cabinet with alcohol wipes and gauze we could replace. If it was not, it would still have a roof and walls. For the moment, that was what we aimed for, a place with edges and a door. We stopped at 1:15 p.m. at a creek so narrow you could step it. We filtered water. We ate energy bars broken into thirds. Tanya changed the dressing on a blister for Ava and checked the colour of Mason's foot, where his boot had rubbed his Achilles raw. She put a piece of moleskin on it and tightened the laces just so, like she was tuning an instrument. He nodded and said, "Thank you," and I realised he had been forgetting to say those 2 words for a week because he had been carrying weight and instructing. The thanks made him look younger for a minute. The radio crackled at 2 p.m. with a voice that made us all freeze. It was the same older ham from the ridge south. "To the station I spoke with last night," he said. "If you're there, be advised. Smoke on your sector. Saw 2 columns around mid-morning, one likely your tower." He said nothing else. He did not have to. We were too far to confirm. We were close enough to know. I pressed the transmit button and said, "Copy." My voice sounded flat. "We moved out," I said. "We will listen at 9 p.m. We reached the maintenance shed at 4:40 p.m. It was a rectangle of cinder block with a roll-up door chained shut and a side door unlocked. Inside were metal shelves with bins, a wall with hand tools on hooks, a water cooler with the 5-gallon jug missing, and a bulletin board with a calendar from the year before, and a drawing of a bear someone had done in a lazy hour. There was dust on the floor, and a mouse nest in the corner. It was beautiful. It had 4 walls and a roof, and a small window you could cover with a piece of plywood, and nails we found in a box. We did that. We stacked 2 old pallets across the door, not because they would stop anyone, but because they would make noise if you kicked the door open. We rolled a barrel in front of the roll-up door. We set a watch and drank water that tasted like the mountain and metal and small green things from the filter. Night fell with a long, slow slide until we realized we were no longer in the light. We boiled water on the small stove for 15 minutes to make a hot drink from a packet. We did not talk about the tower. We did not talk about Jared beyond the fact that he was the reason we had stayed as long as we had and the reason we had left when we did. Sorrow is less sharp when given a task, so we gave it one. We assigned roles for the next day: map the timber road, avoid the valley floor, aim for a ranger spur that would take us to a firebreak. Mason would mark trail, Jody would track time and distance, Tanya would manage rest intervals before anyone asked, Benji would carry the rope and tools, I would take the radio and point. The newcomers would walk and help and learn. They were with us now. At 9 p.m, the radio crackled again with the older ham. We told him our plan without coordinates. He told us that farther west, he had heard rumours of a small organised camp forming at a highway way station where trucks could be parked to form a perimeter. He warned that some groups on the air were not what they seemed. He said to listen more than we spoke. He said that might be the difference. Then, all of a sudden, the signal faded, like someone had walked away from the microphone while still talking. We waited. It did not return. We made a note. Verify at 9 a.m. We slept in turns. In the middle of the night, I woke and heard a small noise outside. I raised my head and listened. It was 2 raccoons arguing over something in the trash scattered behind the shed. It was a normal noise in a sea of not normal. It made me smile into the dark in a way that surprised me. Morning came, with a pale sky and a damp cold that entered through sleeves. We ate, we stretched, we checked our boots for grit that would make blisters, and we moved. We stayed on the timber road where it climbed, then cut off into a narrow path that Mason said he had walked once when he wanted to see if a fire break really broke where the map said it did. It did. The break was a line scraped to mineral soil that ran along a ridge like a scar. From there we could see parts of the valley. Smoke hung over the low ground. Columns rose in 3 places. One looked like an old mill. Another looked like a strip of stores. We made the choice to stay high as long as we could, then cut across to a power line right of way that would take us toward the way station the older ham had mentioned. Power lines scared us. Clear lines are also channels for movement, but the ground under them is kept clear enough that you can see far. That mattered now. By midday, we had covered 6 miles. The newcomers' pace improved as their bodies remembered dragging up to the tower. We stopped at 12:15 p.m. to drink, and at 1:40 p.m. to adjust boots. At 3 p.m. we heard engines and froze. We dropped to one knee on the uphill side of the path and looked through scrub. 2 trucks, both pickup, both full of people, drove slow along a road below. No one laughed, no one shouted. The people in the back held rifles low and covered arcs like a training exercise. The truck stopped at an intersection. 2 people got out and walked north. They knelt at a patch of dirt, then stood, then waved the trucks through. It was a convoy with command and security drilled by necessity, not by time on a range. Tanya squeezed my arm and whispered, "Not alone." It was the first hopeful thing I had heard that day. We did not wave. We did not move. We did not announce ourselves. We let them pass. There would be time later to decide if we wanted to approach the living. Right now, we had a destination that might be a rumour or might be our next rung on the ladder. We also had a tired man in our group who was not admitting it. At 4:10 p.m, Mason stumbled once and then turned the stumble into a step with grace. I caught his eye. He grimaced and then half smiled like he knew he'd been seen. At the next stop, I said, "We rest longer." He didn't argue. That scared me more than if he had. The power line right of way delivered us toward the way station by evening. We stayed at the edge where scrub gave us partial cover. We did not walk in the middle. The last half mile ran alongside a highway clogged with cars parked at odd angles, doors open, hoods up. It was like a parade that had been interrupted and then abandoned. We saw no bodies. That absence made the hair on my neck rise. The station itself came into view like a low square with an overhang. concrete and steel, set back from the road with a wide apron. Trucks had been parked at angles to make a wall. Shipping containers filled gaps. A sign made from a highway board hung on the fence. Water, check. Medical, no entry without talking. 2 people in bright vests stood behind a barrier holding radios. A third sat at a folding table with a clipboard. It looked like command, like the first week of a storm when the county sets up a point of distribution. It looked like the edge of a plan. We stopped 100 yards out. I put my shotgun on the ground and raised my hands. Mason did the same. Tanya stepped out and called, "We have 6. 2 women, 2 men, 1 older man. 1 man with a leg injury that slows him. We have no illness. We will submit to screening." The person at the table stood. He held up his hand like a traffic officer. He called back, "Thank you for announcing. Please approach 1 at a time. We will not take your gear. We will check temperature and ask questions. If you have had a bite, say so now, and we will give you another path." He said it like someone had said it 100 times, and it had not gotten easier. We went through their procedure. It was like ours, but cleaner, more practiced, with more tape on the ground and fewer nerves in the hands of the person using the thermometer. They asked names and wrote them down. They wrote down what we carried, not to take it, but to know who might have what to trade or contribute. They told us the rules inside. No shouting, no weapons brandished, no leaving the station after dark without signing out, no services for people who refuse to help with simple tasks. They used the phrase "participation required" and then softened it with, "We won't ask you to do anything beyond your ability." They looked at Mason's leg and said they had an elastic brace and topical pain relief. Tanya offered to help in the clinic for a shift. Benji said he could fix generators and small engines. Jody said she could draw schematics from memory if someone gave her a pencil. The person at the table smiled for the first time and said, "We have needed pencil work more than people realize." I said I could run a radio and set up a watch schedule. He said, "We have a net at 9 p.m. Welcome." Inside the perimeter, the way station felt like a town square built overnight with pieces from a dozen garages. There was a water fill area with a hose from a tanker truck. There was a line of cots under an overhang where people sat keeping distance and sharing a single outlet strip to charge small things. There was a sign that said, "Meals at 7:30 a.m., 12 p.m., 6 p.m., with a chalk line through the noon meal and, "When available," written in its place. There was a generator the size of a bathtub with a sign that said, "Run 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. only." There was a radio desk with 2 handhelds, 1 base station, and a small notebook open to a page that had columns drawn with a ruler. It had the same careful letters I had seen in our logbook. Seeing that handwriting, even if it belonged to someone else, made me feel steadier. We stayed that night. We contributed. We did not believe the perimeter would hold forever, and neither did the people who ran it. They knew and said plainly that big shelters brought big risks, but they also knew that a place where you could wash your hands with soap out of a dispenser is sometimes the difference between a group that falls apart and one that lasts long enough to move on together. They had a plan to send out small teams to bring in supplies, fuel, medicine, wire, connectors, anything to keep power and water moving. They asked if we would consider joining a team to go back toward the ridge and retrieve our own useful gear if the tower cleared. It would be hard, and it might not be possible, and it might be the only way to replace parts and systems we could not fabricate here. We listened. We looked at each other over the edge of a paper plate with beans and rice. We thought about the emergency zip line, the chain on the ladder, and the cracked connector that had seemed like a small problem and had been the first card in a collapse. At 9 p.m, I sat at the radio desk and called the older Ham from the ridge south. He answered on the second call. He sounded tired. I told him we had moved out and reached a station with organization. I asked if he needed supplies. He laughed once, a short sound like he had not used that muscle in a week. "Cough drops," he said. I wrote it down and underlined it. We confirmed the check-in times. We talked about the way the valley looked from our respective angles. We said we'd listen at 9 a.m. We said goodnight like people on a porch, 2 houses apart after a long day. We slept on cots, and I woke at 2 a.m. to a sound of someone crying quietly in the next bay, and the sound of a train whistle far off. I thought about the tower. I saw in my head the way the morning light hit the glass up top, and the way the steel heated in the noon sun. I saw the logbook open with our notes about smoke columns, and the way Jody wrote numbers without slant. I thought about the whiteboard and the word oxygen I had written and erased. I thought about Jared and how he had said his daughter's name. I said it once under my breath and then tried not to say it again, because names are like handles you can pull until something opens inside you that you need to keep shut long enough to stand up in the morning. At 7:30 a.m., we did tasks that were simple and felt like ritual. We swept the bay. We refilled the hand washing station. We coiled ropes. We cleaned 2 filters. I fixed a frayed cable lugs on the generator with Benji while he told a story about a customer who had tried to fix their alternator belt with a zip tie and had almost succeeded until the zip tie melted. Mason sat with his leg wrapped and his boot off and supervised a map session with Jody and one of the station volunteers who had once driven a school bus and knew back roads like family. Tanya worked in the clinic and came back with a list: gauze, tape, oral rehydration packets, cough drops. She had written cough drops with a little smile on the edge and then shook her head when she showed it to me. It matters, she said. Small comfort is big. By midday, the station commander, a woman with a reflective vest that had been cut down to fit and a voice that sounded like she had run a volunteer fire company once, asked if we would join a scout. The mission was to move along the ridge and check on a radio repeater site 2 miles north. The site had a small solar array, a cabinet, and a battery bank. If it still existed, we could use it to expand the station's communication range. If it had been stripped or destroyed, we could salvage wire and connectors. If the path was clear, we would establish a route for future runs. If it was not, we would mark a map with a red line and not lie to ourselves about what we could do. We agreed. We were 5. Me, Mason, Tanya, Jody, and a station volunteer named Reggie, who had a quiet way and a backpack full of labelled pouches. Benji stayed to fix 3 small engines that had become the heartbeats of the place. The 4 newcomers stayed to rest and help with water, and because they did not yet have the strength to cover that ground and return in a day. We strapped on packs with lighter loads than yesterday and radios with charged batteries. We left at 12:10 p.m. under a sky that had settled into a pattern of fall clouds that promise nothing and deliver whatever they want. The route took us back toward our old ridge, but kept us out of sight of the tower. We saw sign of our passage and others. Broken twigs at a height a hand would reach, footprints filled with water, a glove dropped and then rain-swollen. We stepped over a fresh set of tracks that ended at a point where the ground had been scuffed in a half circle. We did not look for resolution. We kept moving. The repeater site appeared where the map said it would, a chain-link fence around a 12 by 12 concrete pad, a small cabinet locked with a padlock that had seen better days, and a pair of angled panels on a metal mast. The panels were intact. The angle was not ideal for the season, but it would work. The cabinet was locked. Reggie looked at me. I looked at Benji's tools in my mind, and then at our packs. I had a small set of picks I used for padlocks that people had lost keys to at the fire station. It is not a skill I talk about, but it is one that saves a call to a locksmith sometimes. I used it now. The padlock opened with a reluctant click. Inside the cabinet, the battery bank looked old but whole. The controller light was green. A small fan whirred. It was alive. We took a breath. We hooked our radio through a patch cable to use the site as a relay and called the station. The signal came back strong. The station commander's voice sounded closer than it did when we were at the desk. "Copy your field report," she said. "Mark this site as usable. We will plan to maintain it. Good work." The words "good work" flowed through me like heat in fingers that had been numb. We took photographs with a phone that still had a little charge and saved them like they were paper in a storm. We wrote down the panel angles and the connector types and the cable gauge. We closed the cabinet and re-secured the padlock and hid the small scrap of paper where we had written the combination for ourselves in a place only we would know, because you have to make sure your own future self can succeed. Then we heard a sound that made us crouch without thinking, the dry rustle of movement in brush and the tick of a small stone under a foot that is not concerned with stealth. We backed away from the fence and shifted to the downhill side where trees were thickest. 3 infected emerged from the brush where a deer trail cut a corner. They moved strangely, like their legs did not agree with their hips. They did not look up or scan. They moved as if they had one job. The fence stood between them and us. They put hands on it and pushed. The fence bowed and then sprang back. The infected moved along it and pressed again. They did not find the gate. We moved slowly down slope until trees broke their sightline. We did not run. We controlled our breathing and our feet, and then, when we were out of earshot, we exhaled in a chorus that sounded like a sigh from a much larger group. We returned to the station by late afternoon, with the kind of tired that feels like honesty, not defeat. We reported what we had seen. We marked the map. We gave the station a way to talk farther, and a plan to send a maintenance party with a proper lock and better panel angle. The commander nodded. She said, "We build the world by lines. Today, you drew one a little longer. Thank you." It was the kind of sentence that keeps you standing when you want to sit. We ate a meal of rice with beans and a small piece of canned chicken divided 5 ways. We didn't complain. We made notes in the new logbook they handed us to keep for the station's radio team. I wrote in my block letters the way I had up at the tower. I wrote times and frequencies and names. I wrote Fort Skybridge, evacuated under pressure at approximately 10 a.m., day 15, and felt something in me pull tight and then let go. That night, lying on a cot, I thought about choices. We had chosen distance and height, and a steel door with a chain. It had worked until it didn't. It had kept us alive for 2 weeks. It had given us time to teach Jody how to handle a weapon safely, and to show Tanya how to run a generator, and to let Benji prove, again, that tools and care are a kind of love. It had also shown us that only one thing stays safe in this new world: the moment you plan thoroughly and then move before a situation takes your choice away. In the morning, we planned. We planned to return to the ridge, not to retake the tower, but to salvage what we could. The radio mast, the charge controller, the batteries if they hadn't been knocked over, the contents of a cabinet that might still hold a power inverter, every spool of wire we could coil. We planned to move in a line that covered each other. We planned to leave if we saw more than 3 infected at once. We planned to carry cough drops in our top pocket in case we found the older Ham and needed to hand him one before we spoke. We planned because planning is not pretending to control the future. It is choosing who you will be when it arrives. We would not live on a tower anymore. We would not pretend that a steel door stops pressure forever. We would form a moving shelter made of people and the things they know. We would set up small sites, maintain them, and leave when we had to. We would help where we could, move when we must. We would listen more than we spoke. We would choose which voices to answer. We would carry Jared's name and the names of others we would learn, and we would keep a logbook. Because writing is a way to say we were here, and we looked, and we did not look away. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.